happy Mother's Day to all of you mothers. And for those of you that haven't yet been in touch with your moms, please take the time today and wish them a happy Mother's Day. And don't forget the grandmothers. And guys, the women who've given you children, make sure you get in touch with them, take some flowers. Happy Mother's Day to them. We want to spend some time today looking at a couple of instances, stories shared in the scriptures, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, about the role of mothers on the children. We know that as far as we can tell, even based on Freud, I don't agree with much of Freud with regards to everything, but I know that the base of psychology, psychiatry seems to be Freud's study with the mothers. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. One, although often we find in the Bible our relationship with God often referred to as that of the Father. And we refer to God as the Father. In the creation story, we don't have the image of God reflected only in the Father, or only in the man. The image of God is reflected both in the man and the woman. Why? Because it is through the combination of the two that both parents. And the characteristics of a man are a reflection of God, and there are characteristics in a woman that are also the reflection of God. In fact, in Genesis we know, the Bible records that in the image of God created he them, man and woman created he them. It's King James Version. Now, from time to time I depend on a little bit of humor, very little bit of humor. Someone has said that for God so loved the world that he did not send a committee, making a little bit of fun of committees. But there's another saying that somebody else has introduced, and that is, because God could not be visible and tangible, he provided a mother. And just as we say that, I am well aware that unfortunately, in this world, we do have instances of mothers who have not been ideal mothers. So, there may be some of you who have experienced a life without the ideal mother, without the mother that even nature provides. As a result, perhaps you have suffered at the hands of your mother. We know there are plenty of stories recorded where mothers have taken the lives of their children. And I understand that. But we have to also take into consideration what kind of issues those mothers have perhaps dealt with, maybe mental health issues. Perhaps they grew up with a family that was not ideal. But today we're not going to spend time on talking about the imperfect mother, but rather the mother that God planned. The mother that is a natural mother, a normal, if you will, if there is such a thing. Mother. There is no greater influence on a human being than their mother. Now, unfortunately, in today's world, many of the children are raised not by mothers but by daycare centers And I'm not a big fan. I know our church runs a daycare center. We provide a service for families. But ideally, in an ideal world, it would be at the hands and on the knees of a mother that a child would learn all about life. That would be their first teacher and the first comforter and the most important relationship. I want to focus today on a passage in the Bible found in 2 Kings chapter 4. It talks about not only the love but the strength of a mother. I have spoken on this passage many times before, and every time I study it, present it, I love it equally. It makes my hair stand up on end. If you're the back of my neck, it gives me goosebumps. Such a beautiful story. Let's read chapter 4 of 2 Kings. In this chapter, we have 4 instances of miracles that are performed by Elisha. In fact, the miracle recorded just before this is also about a mother and her 2 sons. That we want to talk about today is a very specific sermon on the love of a mother. One day, Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes by our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him, that he can stay there whenever he comes to us." One day, when Elisha came, he went up to his room and lay down there. He said to his servant Gehazi, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her, and she stood before him. Elisha said to him, "Tell her, you have gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" She replied, "I have a home among my own people." "What can be done for her?" Elisha asked. Gehazi said, "Well, she has no son, and her husband is old." Then Elisha said, "Call her." So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. "About this time next year," Elisha said, "you will hold a son in your arms." "No, my lord," she objected. "Don't mislead your servant, O man of God." But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about that same time, birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. The child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers. My head, he said to his father. His father told the servant, "Carry him to his mother." After the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, then shut the door and went out. She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return." "Why go to him today?" he asked. "It's not the new moon or the Sabbath." "It's all right," she said. She saddled the donkey and said to his servant, "Lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, there's a Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? And she answered, everything is all right. When she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, leave her alone. She is in bitter distress. But the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why. Then she cried out, did I ask you for a son? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes? Elisha said to Gehazi, tuck your cloak in your belly, take my staff in your hand and run. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face. But the child's mother said, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So he got up and followed her. Gehazi went on and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him, the boy has not awakened. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay upon the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands, as he stretched himself out upon him. The boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away, walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out upon him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite. And he did. When she came, he said, take your son. She came in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. What an amazing story. This woman had need of nothing, but she was a loving, gentle, God-fearing woman and made provisions for Elisha with no expectations. But when Elisha wanted to do something for her and her family and offered a son, her response was touching. Touching in the sense that she had given up hope of ever being a mother. In the Eastern culture, and even here in North America, if a family cannot have children, it is considered a terrible loss. Fortunately, we have fertility clinics where people spend tens of thousands of dollars to be able to bear children. But in those days, at that time, there was nothing they could do. And not only that, because of the culture of the time, no matter how successful you were, no matter how rich you were, if you couldn't have children, men would often go to another woman or marry other women. And a barren woman would be looked down upon. And if you had girls and didn't have a boy, that was just as bad in the culture. In many places, that is still the case. In my home, my mother had 6 daughters. And she was ridiculed by her extended family because in India, it was a big deal to have a son. And so, when I was born, not realizing the culture, of course, as a kid, and not even realizing then, I was spoiled. I now know, I now recognize that I was spoiled as being one son of 7 children. Spoiled not only by my mother and my father, but by my sisters also. In this case, This woman had no son. And so Elisha prays for her miraculously. She has a son. She has told him, don't joke with me. Don't joke with me. And when this child comes of age, it would be normally about the age of 12. When he reaches maturity by Jewish standards. And he goes into the field to work with his father at harvest time. It would have been terribly hot. Many Bible commentators think that the boy was unprepared to face the heat of that day and suffered from heat stroke. And he cries out, my head, my head. And they carry the boy to the mother. Do you note that no matter how old we are, when we get sick, we don't cry for our father, do we? We cry for our mother. And those of us that have lost our mothers, we yearn for that lap where our mother would put our head. I know as a child, I still do suffer from terrible headaches from the sun. I have to wear dark glasses even now. And I was a kid in India. Oh, I get horrible headaches. I'd have to lie there, turn on the fan or the air conditioner or whatever was available. And when I was at home, often my mother would take a wet towel and put it on my head. The best place for this young boy would have been the lap of his mother. And the mother who had the full confidence that the boy would be just fine, thank you very much, because he was a miracle. If he was a miracle himself in birth, most definitely he would overcome this headache. Now, we're told, after the servant lifted him up, carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon. Sat on her lap until noon. And then he died. Unfortunately, the saddest funerals I have ever conducted have been those of a child whose parents are still alive. I had to face that when I lost my sister and had to face my mother. I had to face, although I didn't conduct my sister's funeral, I had to face the death. But 2 years ago, conducted a funeral of an 18-month-old baby. The parents were unbearable to watch. A friend of mine from high school lost her daughter at the age of 16. The daughter was only 16 years old. And just a couple of days ago was the anniversary of her death. And I still don't know how to communicate with this friend. How do you talk with somebody who has lost their child? There's no greater loss, none, for a mother to lose her baby, the center of her universe. Here, we find the mother in great pain. The love of a mother is very different than that of a father. It's deeper in that the child is a part of the mother, an extension of that mother. The boy sat on her lap until noon. Then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, then shut the door and went out. Now, I want you to notice the attitude of this woman. She called her husband and said, "Please, send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return." "Why go to him today?" he asked. "It's not the new moon or the Sabbath." Listen to her answer. "It's all right." Now, those of you that are married, not long after you're married, you can read your spouse. You even know that if somebody asks a certain question about a certain subject, you know how your spouse would respond to that question, or how your spouse would react to a certain situation. And oftentimes you say, "Oh, she's going to be happy. Oh, he's going to be really mad. Oh, this will surprise him." We know the spouses that well. If in your house you have a problem with plumbing, and you're having a bad day and your husband comes home, your husband knows there's something wrong without you saying a word. It's that look in your eye and the look of disgust that becomes so naturally that you can just read it. And if your spouse tries to hide something from you, to try to not hurt your feelings, or try to make a surprise party for you, do you know how hard it is? Of course, you can read one another. Imagine your son dies and your spouse cannot read the urgency or the shock or the horror of that death. Any person who loses a child would be crying, weeping, tearing off their hair off their head. It'd be impossible to hide. But what is the response of this woman? She says, "It's all right." She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Lead on. Don't slow down for me. Don't slow down unless I tell you." She is going to the prophet. When there is a need, we must run. In this story, Elisha actually represents God, and his servant is the one who is the connection between the two. He represents God, same as God is represented by an angel in many stories. We don't have time to get into that today. When you have a need, and when you need to get a response from God, don't let anything get in your way. Don't slow down. Don't stop. Just go. If somebody stops to say hello, don't acknowledge their hello. Go. So she went out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, there's a Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?'" And the servant of God, the servant of Elisha, runs to the woman. "Is your husband all right? Are you all right? Is the son all right?" And here's what he said. "Everything," she says, "everything is all right." Everything is all right. In our spiritual lives, too often, we pastors, the servants of God, end up being a distraction from your relationship with God. You don't need your pastor to be the go-between. Matthew 23 says, you don't need a priest. Why? He is the high priest. Jesus is the high priest. You go directly to him. Don't stop for anybody. Everything is all right. Don't ask anybody to do special prayers for you. Why? Because you have a direct connection with God himself through Jesus Christ. Everything is all right. When she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away. But the man of God said, leave her alone. She is in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why. Here, where she could not before let her feelings be known to her husband or to the servant, she goes to Gehazi and she lets out her feelings. Do you know? Too often, we get so used to formal prayers, either written out in books or memorized. And we go to God with those formal prayers. And we try very hard never to get angry or disappointed. But God has that expectation from us, like children, that we can demand of God an answer. We can demand of God a response. That is why the Apostle Paul says, because of Jesus Christ, we can go into God boldly. She goes into Elisha boldly, demanding. And she hangs on to his feet. I'm not going to let go. Why? Because she knows, because that is where is the answer to her prayers. That is where life began with God. And look at Elisha's response. When Gehazi goes to take her away, he says, leave her be. Leave her be. Too often, we end up interfering with the relationship of a believer. Don't depend on your pastor. It is you and your God that is the solution to your problems. It's our God, your God, and my God. Then she says, did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes? Basically, say, why did you play with my feelings? I didn't ask for a son. I told you not to do it. She's angry. And wouldn't any mother be? Elisha said to Gehazi, tuck your clothes into your belt and take my staff into your hand and run. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face. When God sends help, he knows the urgency. But God himself comes to settle your problems. It may not be your tangible problems, but most certainly God promises to respond to all of our spiritual, emotional, relational problems. Now Gehazi runs and goes and he prays for the boy, but nothing happens, and he runs back, and when he reaches Elisha, he tells him nothing happened. The boy didn't awaken. Elisha goes back. And into the room, He prays over the son. He lays on top of him, nose to nose, twice. And the boy wakes up. Pardon me. The boy wakes up. 7 times he sneezes, and he opens his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." And he did. When she came, he said, "Take your son." She came in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. What a great faith of a mother. What a great faith of a mother. I doubt very much if this woman had ever witnessed a resurrection before. I doubt very much if this woman had even heard of a resurrection before. I highly doubt if this woman expected a resurrection. She didn't know how it was going to happen or what was going to happen, but she had faith that something was going to happen. It's a faith very similar to that of Abraham. We're told that Abraham knew that the same God, this is in Hebrews chapter 11, that Abraham knew that the same God who could give him his son miraculously could also raise him from the dead. While we're at Abraham, I want to look for just a moment at another mother. God spoke to Abraham and told him, "Take your son Isaac, take your son, your only son, the one that you love, and sacrifice him." Now I have a quick question for you here. What do you think would have happened if Abraham told his wife, "I'm going to take your son and sacrifice him to God"? I have a pretty good idea that Abraham didn't tell his wife, because if he would have, she would have taken that same sacrificial knife and drove it into the chest of Abraham himself. She wouldn't have let him touch the boy. Am I wrong? Which mother would? None. Now I want to draw a couple of lessons here. Mothers, God bless you all. Here's a story, and there's an additional symbolism here. The boy who is physically dead also represents your children who are spiritually dead, who've gone away from God, and for whom you have no hope. Your neighbors, your family, everybody looks at you as if you're a failure because your children have become spiritually dead. Here is the story, the assurance that the heart of a loving mother can resurrect those children, that child. There was a young man who born into a family where the father was very, very worldly, known for drinking, partying, and womanizing. And the mother was a very, very godly mother, an angel. The mother wanted the son to become a Christian and to be with her in her spiritual journey. But instead, the boy idolized his father and became a worldly man. Spend time womanizing, partying, drinking, doing everything that mother didn't want him to do. But the mother prayed. When the rest of the world would have looked down on this young man and given up, the mother continued to pray. Continued. Until the age of 31, when he gave his heart to God and confessed to being a Christian. Changed his life. Began to study the Word of God. Became one of the greatest forces in the Christian world, in the Christian church. Augustine is his name. Now, I make a quick point. I don't agree with everything theologically. Augustine is considered a doctor of the church, one of the, in fact, probably the most influential person both in Catholicism and in Protestantism, the Apostle Paul. However, his mother, the constant prayer and persistent teaching of her mother, eventually brought him to God through the Bishop Ambrose. And the mother's name is Monica. Monica. She's canonized. She was, what's the word I'm looking for? She was made a saint, called Saint Monica, because of her prayers for her son. I know the influence of mothers in all of our lives. Certainly, the influence of his mother made a big difference, all the difference, on the life of Jesus Christ. That's why God chose Mary in a very special way. And look at the attitude of Jesus. When the sins of the world were on him and he was on the cross, what did he say? His only earthly concern, he said to John, your mother, and he said to your mother, your son. I know in my life, my mother played a big role. My father was a pastor, later on an administrator in the church, traveled a lot. All of our evening worships were done with our mother. They were longer. In the morning was just a prayer. In the evenings, Bible readings, conversations and prayers. My mother prayed in the Urdu language. And just like I know the Lord's Prayer off by heart, I know my mother's prayer after all these years. It was her lessons in our lives. She taught us to work hard, to stand for what you believe, ignore the crowd, be strong. I remember in 1996, I had a relatively successful business. In addition to that, I was also pastoring a church. I was only going to the business office once a week on Mondays. I was married, got very, very sick. Very sick. Lost my marriage, lost my business, lost my home, quit my job with the church. Didn't work for 7 years. Doctor, specialist, told me, don't think you're ever going to get better. And don't imagine your life is going to come back the way it used to be. You have to start a new life. I was homeless, penniless. My father gave me his Mercedes to drive himself. drove an old rusty car. My mother sat me down, and I told her, I said, the doctor said I'll have to start all over again. She said to me, it's okay. When you were a baby, we held your hand and taught you how to walk. Now, middle-aged man, she said, it's okay. We're here to hold your hand. We'll teach you how to walk. Then my father said, if you want to start that business again, we'll sell the house. Start again. We didn't have to sell the house, but it was the principle of looking after my parents as my mother had taught me. My mother had taught me that in our culture, it is the responsibility of a son and a brother to look after his sisters and his parents. That was ingrained into me by my mother. It was that principle that brought me back to work and got me back on my feet. It was the teaching and the love and the encouragement of my mother. I was fortunate in that when my mother was very old and sick, the doctors had given up on her. She was in ICU for 6 months. They said, take her home. She's not going to survive. She came home with a tube in her tummy. They gave her months to live. I gave up all my work, whatever, again, and I stayed home with her for 3.5 years. And guess what? In 3 months, a tube came out of her tummy. She began to eat. Her hair began to grow back out. And she lived with us for 3.5 years and died of something completely unrelated. But it was my privilege, joy, to be able to spend those years with my mother being a baby, just as she for me when I was a baby. For those of us that still have our mothers and our fathers, let us make sure that we hold them up with love and affection. In today's world, we find families with 1 or 2 children have a hard time raising them. But in the old days, for those of us that are older, when there were no washing machines and electric stoves and permanent jobs, our parents raised us through all kinds of difficulties. And those of you that are young, please enjoy the time with your parents and specifically your mom. Jesus says in John, how often, John chapter 19. Let me read it. It's much better the way he says it. In John chapter 19, verse 26. John 19. Jesus makes a reference to motherhood, if you will. Oh no, we're at Jesus on the cross here, referring to Matthew 23 is where we want. Matthew 23:37. Matthew 23, verse 27. He says, how often have I looked? How often have I, 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those who sent you, How often have I longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing, like the mother. You know, in our world, when you find somebody who's afraid of everything, the word we use is chicken. We say, hey, look, what a chicken you are, afraid you are. If you go into a chicken pen, chickens will run from you. You know I have chickens, I raise chickens. If you go to a chicken who's sitting on eggs or who has just had fresh chicks, you try and approach that chicken, you will be 100% sure that that chicken will turn into a lion and you're going to think that that chicken is going to kill you. That is a mother. That is what Jesus is referring to. How often I have tried to protect you, but you just didn't listen. My friends, as we celebrate Mother's Day, we ought to remember that God is like a mother. In Isaiah, he says, what mother would hear her baby cry and not want to feed her? How can you leave your baby? You can't. That's God. 2 lessons. 1, let us remember the gift of motherhood. The gift of motherhood on this blessed Mother's Day. And remember that as children of God, we have a path back to Him, just as we saw in the example of the Shunammite woman. It's unfortunate that we only celebrate Mother's Day once a year, but like those annual holidays that I don't really like so much, we should celebrate Mother's Day every day. I know many of you do. May God bless you as you spend time with your families and acknowledge your mothers on this Mother's Day, and a happy Mother's Day to all. God bless you.